How's it going, everybody? Happy Monday, and welcome back to the second episode of Bay 13. If you are listening to this on Monday, go ahead and have yourself a good week. If you're not, I don't know what you're doing. Today we're going to be talking on a few different topics, such as driving, to buying your first car, to finding your project car. But before we get started on all that, we actually have a question from a listener on the first episode. This listener wants to know a little bit more on what Bay 13 actually is. Bay 13 is a local bay at a Ford dealership. People who have worked in that bay before usually say it's an unlucky bay. The two people who were working in that bay before me lasted less than a week. I think the first one lasted maybe 2-3 days, and the last one lasted like 4 days, almost a week, but not quite. I don't know if it's actually unlucky or if it's just superstition, but either way, it's going okay for me and I haven't had any problems with it so far. If you guys have any questions you would like answered, go ahead and shoot us a quick email at bay13.wn@gmail.com. And with that being said, let's move on to our first topic we will cover today, which is driving. We all get around to driving at different times, and personally, I think I was a little late to the driving game. I didn't start driving until I was about 19, although I did drive occasionally before that, just very short amounts of time. When I was little, sometimes my parents would let me drive around the loop at Yale Lake at a campground. While it wasn't exactly illegal, what harm can be done from driving less than 10 miles an hour around a camp road for 15 minutes at a time? Kind of after that a little bit, I would occasionally drive Alex's F-250 around the airport when we were trying to diagnose a problem. Technically, the airport is private property, and we had permission, so it was fairly legal. The truck I was driving was an automatic and had a shifting problem, and so me and Alex were driving around, and he was in the engine compartment while I was driving. Not very fast, but he was using a hand pump, a vacuum gauge, to try and get the truck to shift because it was a vacuum shift truck. And while it didn't work out the way we needed it to, it was a step in the right direction trying to diagnose this problem. A little while after that, I actually went to take my driving test after studying the driving little booklet they give you for a couple months. I think I read that book 3 or 4 times, and none of it actually really settled in to my brain. I couldn't remember hardly anything from it anymore. But I took my driving test in a Camry, and it was pretty easy. I mean, I've driven a little bit, I understood the basics of driving and what you should and shouldn't do, but I was nervous all the same to be driving with a stranger. And it was my first time driving with somebody I didn't really know, and he didn't speak a lot of English. And so for me, that was tricky because I couldn't ask him many questions because he didn't really understand. Or if he did understand, he didn't know how to say them back to me, and it was just a really bad experience. Although I did pass, I was 2 points away from passing, and he said if I missed like one more thing that I wouldn't have been able to get my license at all and I'd have to retest. After I got my license, I started driving the Suburban. My dad said it would be a good idea to drive it, not only because I would have no problem seeing anything and anyone on the road, but also if I got into a crash, it was big and heavy, it wouldn't be crushed or, depending on the crash, any damage at all. While trucks and Suburbans are great things to learn how to drive, they're definitely not the best if you are, a college kid driving 30 miles a day to get to college. They go through fuel like you wouldn't believe. And so that made me want to start looking into buying another car, which actually brings us into our second topic, buying your first car. There's a lot of cars out there for sale, and you kind of have to be careful which one you decide to buy. I would always recommend taking a car that you're considering buying to a dealership for a basic checkup. It costs anywhere from $100 to $150, but trust me, it's definitely worth it. These technicians that will be looking over your car have had a lot of time and experience looking for problems and are best able to tell you if your car has a major problem or is showing signs that there will be a major problem in the future. I searched online for a car for quite a long time. I wanted to find one that I really liked and that I know that I would like for a long time. I started looking for a couple different cars at first. I looked for a couple of Ford Rangers because they're trucks and I like to go camping, so I figured it could hold at least a bunch of firewood and my tent and a couple bags of food. I looked at some Crown Victorias. They also have big trunk space, so hold my tent and all that, and I could bring a bunch of people. And I figured that if I was driving an old police car, nobody would try and cut me off in the middle of the freeway. That was kind of my other reasoning for one of those. After searching on Craigslist for probably close to 3 or 4 months, I finally came across an ad to a car that I've never seen before. It was a 1986 Pontiac Fiero for $3,000 with 40,300 miles. And at first I'm thinking, that's really low mileage for such an old car. Why are they only asking $3,000 for it? Well, it turns out the lady who owned it, it was her father's, and her father handed it down to her. He since has passed away, and she was tired of the memory every time she'd walk into the garage. And so she asked her husband to put it up on Craigslist for sale. And that's when I came along. I think from the time I saw the Craigslist post to the time I had the keys and the title in hand and all the paperwork signed, it was about 2 weeks. I didn't take it to a shop or get it looked over because I was super excited and I wanted to drive it home. And the car being 30 years old, I figured not many people would know what to look for in a car that old or rare. Over the next couple months after I bought it, I kept finding little things wrong with it that needed to be fixed. I changed the way I looked at it to a point where it was beginning to be more of an annoyance than, a car I enjoyed driving. And after a while, I started to accept the fact that it was going to be a project, and that it would probably always be a project because it's an old car and things keep falling apart or breaking. And that kind of brings us into our third topic, which is project cars. Project cars can be a lot of fun and a huge learning experience, and can also be a huge headache at times depending on what you're trying to accomplish. I think it's definitely more than a mindset than anything, and you will start to look at your car differently. The first thing we're going to go over is finding versus buying your first project car. A project car, or your new project car, can be a car that you already own. I decided to take a car that I already owned and turn it into my project car. So for me, that was pretty easy. I already had the car, and I knew what I wanted to do with it. From there, I made a plan. The second option is you can go buy a project car. Typically, project cars, when you buy them, you're looking for potential rather than if it works right now. If it works right now, that's great, and it's going to be a lot easier for you down the road. But if it doesn't, you're going to have a lot more fun trying to fix it, but also going to have a lot more headaches as well. You also kind of have to understand that if you buy a car that's so strange and kind of out there, you're going to get a lot of criticism. You're going to get a lot of love from the people who really like these cars. But you're also going to get a lot of hate from people that don't understand why you like these cars, or that they don't like these cars themselves. A Fiero is kind of a car that you either love it or hate it. I love it, I really do. I think they're cool cars, and a lot of people don't really think so. There was a lot of bad hype on Fieros catching a fire back in the day when they were made, but that has since been fixed and is no longer a problem. I don't really care what other people think. I just know that it's not finished, and that when it is finished, I'm going to love it even more than I do now. If your project car runs and drives fine and all you're really doing is interior work, it can be a lot of fun, and sometimes can only take an afternoon or two, depending on what you're trying to do. In my Fiero, I had to rewire and install new speakers and a head unit. One thing I'm going to say is don't get discouraged if you're doing interior work and you break a few trim clips. I've broken way more than I can count, both at home and at the dealership. And sometimes these clips are only meant to be used once, and are usually pretty fragile. You can always buy interior trim tools at, I think Harbor Freight has them, and I know Amazon has them. I'll put a link in the description where you can purchase these tools. They do cost a little bit more than I'd like them to, but I use them all the time in Bay 13. Splicing wires, if you're not familiar, can be a pretty scary thing for some. And it's really not as hard as it looks. While you can get by with a pair of diagonal cutters and a few crimp connectors if you're careful, most people aren't that good, and I would recommend purchasing some wire strippers with a crimp section on the end. You can usually pick these up from just about anywhere for pretty cheap. If worst comes to worst, there's always YouTube tutorials that will help you out in a pinch. I know when I started, I looked at way more YouTube videos than anything else. If your car looks pretty good and it's a more in-depth problem, like an engine problem or a drivability problem, you should look into doing a lot of research And be prepared to have your car sit for a few days to a few weeks depending on your skill level and what the problem is. Things do not always go the way you want them to, and so have a backup plan. I rely on my project car as a daily driver because mostly what I'm doing is cosmetic, but if what you're doing is like an engine performance thing, I definitely wouldn't recommend having your project car as your daily driver. If it does take a little while, do not get discouraged. Everything is learning experience. Also, one thing to keep in mind when you're going to buy your project car is how difficult it's going to be to find parts. Most parts are easy to find for most vehicles until you start getting back in time. My car's from 1986, so it's over 30 years old, and parts are getting harder and harder to find every year. If your project car is even older than mine, like you're working on a 74 Continental, parts are going to be extremely hard to find, and you could be waiting a long time for a part that you want to show up. For Fieros, it's not actually that bad right now. The popularity of Fieros comes and goes every couple years. Sometimes they'll be really popular and other times they won't be as popular. A lot of Fieros are sold in the winter just because they're usually summer cars and they're a lot of fun to drive in the summer, and they really should be garaged in the winter. The FieroStore.com has most parts for Fieros, and I believe right now from there you're able to order a catalog with all the parts you'll need, and I think that catalog's also free. When you finally do find a car that you buy, and whether it be a Volkswagen or a Jeep or a Pontiac or a Chevy or a Ford or whatever you buy, there will always be different car communities that comes with it. I know that Volkswagen have different communities or groups for their Bugs, their wagons, and Jettas, as well as all the other ones pretty much out there. Jeep has communities surrounding the Wranglers, the Cherokees, and the Comanches. Even Pontiac has the Fiero Club. They have IROC clubs. My recommendation would be to go find a couple of these clubs or communities and kind of make your way into it. Talking to these people is a great way to make friends with new people, and it's also a good chance to ask them a lot of questions on what they did to their project if you're not quite sure what you want to do with yours. For Fieros, you can go typically on Pennock's Fiero Forum. That's PENNOCKS, Fiero Forum. There's not typically a lot of people there anymore, and if there are, they're usually pretty spread out. You can go to Worldwide Fiero on Facebook, and that's a good place. Usually the main group on there is the Washington group. There's also the USFA, which is the United States Fiero Association. That's kind of a cool group too that talks to everybody that has a Fiero. Not only can you join these groups to talk to a lot of cool people, but there's also a lot of car shows that you can go to talk to these people as well. I know for sure in downtown Portland, every Saturday, I think, is Red Door Meet. Red Door Meet's kind of a cool place. You park downtown on the little side streets under the bridge. It's huge. There's hundreds of people. You park and go look at other people's cars, and there's people driving up and down the middle, and you can always take a lot of pictures, and it's actually kind of a cool place just to go and spend some time. There's a bunch of vendors there that sell food, and I think you can buy t-shirts every once in a while. But I think the main point I'm trying to make here is when you do find a project car you want to work on, kind of get surrounded by that community and ask questions, and people are usually more than willing to help because chances are somebody's helped them and they've been in your shoes already. Let us know if you have any funny stories or questions about learning to drive or buying a car. And if you did manage to find a project car, we'd love to hear what you plan to do with it. Message us about it at bay13.wn@gmail.com. If you don't want to send us an email, you can always message us at bay13 on Facebook. And as always, our Facebook page and email will be listed in the description. Also, don't forget to subscribe to us at bay13 on SoundCloud and follow us on Facebook at bay13. And that's going to wrap up this episode. Thank you all for listening, and we will see you here next week in Bay 13.